You close your bedroom door and can finally take off the mask. That invisible mask you wear all day, pretending everything's fine, that you know what you're doing, that you belong somewhere. But when the door closes and you're alone with your thoughts, the truth hits like a stone to your chest. You don't belong anywhere. No one really knows you. And worst of all is that even in this absolute solitude, you still feel invisible eyes judging you, whispering that you're not enough, that you're doing everything wrong, that you should be different. It's as if the entire world were a courtroom, and you were simultaneously the defendant and the only one without a lawyer. Franz Kafka understood this pain better than anyone. He once wrote that, "We are as lonely as the stars in the sky, but unlike them, we cannot shine." Today, you'll discover how to transform this judged loneliness into a force that no one can touch, how Kafka found dignity in isolation, and how you can do the same to rebuild your life from this new understanding of yourself. The cruelest judgment doesn't come from a real courtroom. It comes from that internal voice that never stops talking, analyzing every word you said, every gesture you made, every moment you tried to be authentic and failed. Marina discovered this at 34, when she finally had the courage to leave a marriage that was slowly suffocating her. She thought the hard part would be facing her family, friends, the social pressure from those who said she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But what she didn't expect was the courtroom that installed itself in her own mind after the dust settled. Even alone in her new apartment, surrounded only by the silence and freedom she had sought so desperately, she felt as if thousands of people were watching her every move, questioning her choices, whispering that she had made a terrible and irreversible mistake. At night, when she should have been celebrating her newfound independence, she found herself lying awake, listening to an imaginary court debating her life, her merits, her failures, as if her existence were a legal process that never reached a final verdict. Kafka intimately knew this feeling of being judged for crimes you didn't even know you had committed. In his diaries, he wrote about the anguish of feeling constantly observed, judged, as if his entire life were a legal process where he never knew exactly what he was being accused of, but knew the sentence would always be guilt. The paradox of judged solitude is that you feel completely invisible and totally exposed at the same time. It's like being naked in an empty square, but knowing that invisible cameras are recording every imperfection, every moment of vulnerability, every desperate attempt to appear normal. Rodrigo experienced this when he decided to leave his well-paying corporate job to follow his dream of becoming a writer, a decision that everyone around him classified as irresponsible and immature. For months, he worked alone in his small studio, with no one to talk to about his existential doubts, his paralyzing fears, his small daily progress that seemed insignificant against the immensity of what he had left behind. But even in the most absolute solitude, far from the disapproving looks of family and sarcastic comments from former colleagues, he carried the weight of imaginary stares from everyone who said he was making a mistake, that he was wasting his life, that he should be more realistic and accept that dreams are for teenagers. His solitude wasn't peaceful. It was populated with judging ghosts that made every blank page an accusation of incompetence, every written line evidence that maybe everyone was right about his naivety. Kafka described this experience as living in a castle you can see but never reach, where approval and acceptance always seem to be one step away. But when you finally approach, you discover the doors are locked and the guards don't even recognize your right to be there. The painful truth that no one wants to admit is that external judgment is just the amplified echo of the internal judgment you've carried all along. When you're alone and still feel judged, it's because you've internalized the voices of everyone who once said you weren't enough, that your aspirations were too grandiose, that your sensitivity was weakness, that your way of seeing the world was wrong. It's as if you've created a mental courtroom, where all your critics have permanent front-row seats, but you never received the right to defense, or even met the lawyer who should represent you. Anna realized this brutally when she moved to a city where she knew absolutely no one, escaping from a family that always had comments about every aspect of her life. She thought she would finally be free from suffocating family expectations, constant disapproving looks, seemingly innocent but deeply cutting comments about her life choices, her appearance, her relationships, her career. But she discovered, to her horror, that she carried all these judges within herself like a personal Supreme Court that never recesses. Even when she was completely alone, walking through streets where no one knew her, where she was just another anonymous person in the crowd, she felt constant and inexplicable pressure to be different, better, more acceptable, as if there were invisible cameras broadcasting every moment of her life to an audience she couldn't see but knew was always watching. Kafka captured this anguish with surgical precision when he wrote that man cannot live without a lasting confidence in something indestructible within himself, though both that confidence and that indestructible something may remain permanently hidden from him. What he was saying is that even when the entire world seems to judge us, even when we carry a Supreme Court in our minds, there's something in us that's beyond any courtroom, beyond any judgment, beyond any need for external approval. The path to real freedom isn't finding approval or completely eliminating judgment, because that would be impossible in a society that functions based on constant judgments. Real freedom is learning to inhabit your solitude with absolute dignity, transforming isolation from punishment into a sacred sanctuary where you can finally find yourself. Kafka did this through writing, creating literary worlds where protagonists faced absurd Kafkaesque situations that mirrored his own life experience with painful precision. He discovered that when you completely accept your condition as an outsider, when you stop fighting judgment as if it were a war that needs to be won and simply observe it like a storm passing over you without really touching you, something magical and transformative happens. You begin to find strength in your very strangeness, power in your very inadequacy to social standards, beauty in your very inability to fit into molds that were made for other people. It's as if you discovered that what you always thought was a fundamental character flaw was actually your greatest characteristic, your unique and irreplaceable mark on the world. What makes your existence have meaning that no other person can replicate? There's a profound and transformative difference between being alone by external circumstance and consciously choosing solitude as a deliberate act of self-preservation and deep personal growth. When Carlos decided to spend 6 entire months without social media, without going out to unnecessary social gatherings, without exposing himself to constant external opinions, focusing only on understanding who he really was, beneath all the layers of expectations he had accumulated over the years, well-meaning friends thought he was going through severe depression. But he was doing exactly the opposite of sinking into depression. He was methodically healing from years and years of living for imaginary audiences, of molding his personality according to what he thought people wanted to see, of modifying his opinions to fit into groups, of suppressing his deepest instincts to be accepted in circles that ultimately didn't even truly know him. In the first days of this voluntary retreat, the silence was deafening and almost unbearable. The absence of constant external validation made him question every thought he had, every desire he felt, every dream he nurtured, as if none of it was valid without approval from external witnesses. But gradually, week after week, a deeper and more authentic voice began to emerge from the silence, a voice that didn't need approval because it already knew its own worth, that didn't need validation because it was connected to something greater than any human opinion. Kafka called this finding the indestructible in oneself, that part of you that exists independently of any courtroom, any judgment, any external expectation, that essence that remains intact even when the entire world seems to be against you. The deepest and most revolutionary Kafkaesque paradox is that you can only truly belong when you completely accept, without reservations, that you don't belong to any of the groups that surround you. When you stop trying to fit in desperately, to modify your fundamental essence to be accepted by people who may not even deserve to have you in their lives, when you embrace your outsider nature with genuine pride instead of paralyzing shame, something extraordinary and almost magical begins to happen around you. The right people begin to feel magnetically attracted to your raw authenticity, to your courage, to be genuinely different in a world that rewards conformity. Not all people, and certainly not in the superficial way you expected when you still sought universal approval, but the right people, those rare souls who recognize and deeply value the rarity of someone who had enough courage to be genuinely themselves, even knowing it would mean walking alone most of the time. Kafka was never popular during his lifetime. He was seen by contemporaries as strange, too intense, too different for the social standards of the time. But his courageous willingness to completely inhabit his strangeness, to fearlessly explore the shadowy and unexplored territories of human experience that others avoided because they were uncomfortable, is exactly what made his work timeless and universally relevant to anyone who has ever felt like a stranger in their own world. Have you ever felt like you were permanently living in a legal process that never ends, never reaches a verdict, where you're simultaneously the accused and the only participant without the right to adequate defense? As if, even in moments of absolute solitude, when you're physically alone in your room or walking down an empty street, there was still an invisible and inexorable crowd, analyzing your every move, every breath, every desperate attempt to be authentic in a world that seems to punish. Authenticity? I know you felt this because you wouldn't be here listening to these words if you didn't deeply recognize this torturous sensation of being judged, even when you're completely alone with your thoughts. If you intimately know this mental courtroom that never recesses, that operates 24 hours a day, analyzing every aspect of your existence, write in the comments just these 4 simple words: I'm also being judged. And you don't need to explain anything more. You don't need to tell your story. You don't need to justify anything. These 4 words create a silent but powerful connection between people who understand the crushing weight of carrying invisible judges wherever they go. When you do this, when you have the courage to admit this vulnerability, you're telling someone who feels exactly this way that they're not alone in this infinite and seemingly hopeless process. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, you'll also remember that the most important judgment, the only one that really matters in the end, is the one you make of yourself. Real and lasting transformation happens when you finally realize that constant judgment isn't really about you, about your flaws or inadequacies. It's about others' desperate need to keep the world organized in controllable and predictable categories, because genuine authenticity is frightening to those who live on the surface. When you live authentically, when you consciously refuse to conform to expected standards, when you choose to be true to your nature, even if it means being misunderstood, you become an uncomfortable and threatening mirror for those who have abdicated their own authenticity in exchange for social security. Your simple existing as yourself, without masks, without performances, becomes a silent but disturbing question that echoes in the consciousness of those who observe you. What if I could also be who I really am? What if I also had the courage to remove these masks? That's exactly why social pressure to conform is so intense, so constant, so suffocating sometimes. It's not because you're doing something objectively wrong or harmful. It's because your courage to be different, to follow your own path, painfully exposes the cowardice of those who chose the safety of uniformity, the comfort of being just another face in the crowd. Kafka deeply understood that being judged, being misunderstood, being seen as strange is simply the inevitable price of being real in a world that prefers well-rehearsed performances to raw and uncomfortable truth. Solitude completely stops being punishment when you consciously transform it into a deliberate and empowered choice. When you realize with absolute clarity that being alone doesn't mean at all being abandoned by the world, but rather being finally free from the constant and exhausting need to explain, justify, or modify your fundamental essence to be accepted by people who may not even truly know you. It's like discovering that you can be deeply happy without a constant audience validating every move, that you can be profound and meaningful without needing to impress anyone with your depth, that you can be immensely valuable without needing external certification or approval from authorities you don't even respect. This is the most radical and transformative Kafkaesque freedom, the extraordinary capacity to exist fully, to flourish completely, even when no one is watching, even when no one approves of your choices, even when you're literally the only one in the world who understands the real value of what you are and what you have to offer to existence. The last courtroom you need to face and definitively win isn't out there, in the external world, in others' opinions. It's firmly installed within you, operating 24 hours a day. It's that familiar but destructive voice that still asks, with painful frequency, whether you're really enough, whether you genuinely deserve to be happy, whether you have the fundamental right to take up space in this world, being exactly who you are, without modifications, without improvements, without the need to become someone different to deserve love and respect. Kafka literally spent his entire life in this internal courtroom, fighting against judges who seemed impossible to satisfy. But through his titanic struggle, he left us the golden key to freedom, the radical and courageous acceptance of our own strangeness, of our own inadequacy to external standards imposed by society, of our own vital need to walk a unique path that only we completely understand. When you finally accept without resistance that you'll always be a little strange to this superficial world, that your depth will always be misunderstood by minds that prefer the surface, that your sensitivity will always be seen as fragility by hearts that harden to survive, something absolutely miraculous happens in your life. You completely stop wasting your precious vital energy trying to be accepted by those who can't see your value, and begin to use all that energy to flourish into the extraordinary person you always were, but who was hidden behind desperate attempts at belonging in places where you should never have tried to fit in. The Kafkaesque journey of self-acceptance isn't linear or easy. There are days when you'll feel you've regressed, that you've returned to the starting point, that all evolution was an illusion. But these moments of apparent setback are actually an essential part of the process of becoming who you really are. It's as if you were learning a new language, the language of your own soul. And like any deep learning, there are moments of confusion, doubt, apparent impossibility. But every time you choose authenticity instead of performance, every time you choose truth instead of acceptance, every time you choose to be faithful to your nature instead of modifying it to please, you strengthen this new version of yourself that doesn't need external approval to exist fully. Conscious solitude becomes a sacred laboratory where you experiment with being completely yourself, without editing, without filters, without the pressure to be understood or approved. It's in this protected space that you discover your peculiarities aren't defects to be corrected, but unique characteristics that make your contribution to the world irreplaceable. It's where you realize that your different way of seeing things isn't a limitation, but a valuable perspective that can offer insights no one else could have. Kafka knew that real transformation happens in conscious isolation, away from external noises that prevent us from hearing our own voice. He wrote his most profound works in silent rooms, During solitary nights, when he could finally access that part of himself that remained hidden during obligatory social interactions. And it's exactly in this voluntary isolation that you too can discover who you really are, beneath all the layers of expectations, conditioning, and fears you've accumulated throughout life. The process of completely accepting yourself is an act of silent rebellion against a world that profits from your dissatisfaction with yourself. Every time you choose to love yourself instead of criticizing yourself, every time you choose to honor your sensitivity instead of hardening it, every time you choose to follow your intuition instead of ignoring it, you're participating in a personal revolution that has the power to transform not only your life, but also the lives of everyone who observes you living authentically. True victory isn't in finally being accepted by others. True victory is in reaching the point where external acceptance becomes irrelevant because you've found something much more valuable, deep and unconditional self-acceptance. When you reach this point, when you finally become your own best friend instead of your worst critic, something magical happens. The right people begin to appear naturally in your life, attracted by your authenticity, by your courage to be different, by your refusal to pretend to be someone you're not. If you've made it this far, to these final words, it's because your soul recognizes that there's a different path from what the world offers. A lonelier path, perhaps, but infinitely more truthful. Your journey doesn't look like the journeys people talk about in superficial motivational posts. Your search is deeper, more complex, more real, and for that very reason, more valuable. This channel exists specifically for those who, like Kafka, understand that life's most important questions don't have simple or quick answers, but deserve to be explored with all the courage and brutal honesty we can muster. Every week, we create a sacred space where you can pause, breathe deeply, and remember that your strangeness isn't a defect that needs to be corrected, but your unique and precious mark on the world. Subscribe to receive weekly reflections that honor your depth and help you transform constant judgment into unshakable inner strength. Because your journey of self-acceptance is an act of silent but powerful rebellion in a world that wants everyone the same on the surface, everyone conforming, everyone predictable. Together, we'll discover that being judged can be not just bearable, but the very path to true freedom. Your authenticity is a rare gift to this world, even when it doesn't yet know how to receive it properly.